Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. The Lectitio Divinitatus is one of the most significant texts in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, yet much of its original content remains shrouded in mystery. The idea that parts of this pivotal scripture are missing, erased, or hidden adds a tantalizing layer of intrigue to the lore surrounding the Emperor and his relationship to the Imperium. The very nature of these missing pages invites speculation about what knowledge might have been lost and what truths the Imperium may never know. Were these pages erased by enemies of humanity, or were they deliberately removed to protect the Emperor's carefully constructed image? And if they were destroyed or concealed, what knowledge could they have contained? This question has haunted historians, scholars, and heretics alike for millennia. The Lectitio Divinitatus stands as both a tool of faith and a vessel of power in the Imperium. But it also represents a great mystery at its core, an empty space in history that is yet to be filled with answers. The loss of the Lectitio Divinitatus's missing pages is not just about the physical absence of a text, but the absence of potential revelations, lost knowledge, and unspoken truths. The text itself, which originated during the latter days of the Great Crusade, would come to serve as the foundation for the Emperor's worship and the establishment of the Ecclesiarchy, the religious institution that would carry his divine image for millennia. Yet, in the chaos of the Age of Strife and the dark days following the Horus Heresy, certain parts of the Lectitio vanished. Whether they were purged by the Emperor's own hand or swept away by the forces of the Inquisition, the consequences of their loss ripple through the Imperium in ways that are still felt today. The question that remains is not just about what was lost, but about the larger story these missing pages tell. The story of power, faith, and control within the heart of the Imperium. This question also forces us to reconsider the very nature of the Emperor's divinity. For if these pages once contained information that could alter our understanding of the Emperor as a god, what truths have been concealed from the people of the Imperium? Was the Emperor truly a divine being, or was his transformation into a god merely a political maneuver designed to secure power and control over humanity? And if the Emperor was not a god, what would that mean for the Imperium's faith? These missing pages represent more than just an incomplete historical record. They could be the key to understanding the deep contradictions that lie at the heart of the Imperium itself. And yet, the more we learn about the Lectitio Divinitatus, the more we come to realize that its missing pieces are perhaps more important than the text that remains. As we journey through the history of the Lectitio Divinitatus and its missing pages, we must ask ourselves, what was erased and why? What secrets were deemed too dangerous to be known? These questions will guide us as we explore the origins of the Lectitio Divinitatus, the political ramifications of the Emperor's rise to godhood, and the terrifying forces that conspired to erase parts of this sacred text. We will delve into the deeper implications of these missing pages and consider the possibility that they hold the answers to questions the Imperium itself may never be ready to confront. The Lectitio Divinitatus is a testament to the power of religion, myth, and the manipulation of truth. An ancient manuscript that tells us not only about the Emperor and his divine status, but about the Imperium's eternal struggle to control its own narrative. The Lectitio Divinitatus was born in the tumultuous and visionary period of the Great Crusade, when humanity was unified under the Emperor's banner and was in the midst of its grand expansion across the stars. It was during this time that the Emperor's influence began to solidify into something far more significant than simply a military leader, and his followers began to see him as something more than human. This shift was gradual but inevitable, driven both by the Emperor's own actions and by the desperate needs of humanity. The Lectitio Divinitatus did not appear out of nowhere. It was a reflection of the growing sense of awe and reverence that the Emperor inspired in those who fought beside him, and in those who believed that his destiny was not merely to conquer, but to guide humanity to a greater future. At its core, the Lectitio Divinitatus was an early form of the Emperor worship that would later become entrenched as the central pillar of the imperial cult. It was not just a religion, it was a doctrine, a political and ideological tool designed to unify humanity under the emperor's divine leadership. The belief that the emperor was a god, the living deity of mankind, was not immediately embraced by all. Many in the emperor's inner circle, including his Primarchs and most of the Adeptus Astartes, rejected the idea of deifying him. To them, the emperor was a being of extraordinary intellect and power, a living embodiment of humanity's potential, but not a god. The Lectitio Divinitatus, however, found fertile ground among certain factions within the Imperium, those who saw in the emperor a figure deserving of veneration, someone whose leadership transcended the limits of mere mortality. This transition from reverence to full deification was gradual. The emperor, who was so often seen as a pragmatist and a ruler, did not initially embrace the idea of being worshipped as a god. He was a man of reason and logic, not of superstition. Yet the Lectitio Divinitatus spread among the masses, especially those far from the emperor's direct gaze. As the Crusade continued and the Imperium expanded, the emperor's image became increasingly intertwined with religious iconography. This was a necessary step for ensuring unity across the disparate worlds of the Imperium, many of which had been ravaged by millennia of isolation and strife. In the eyes of these people, the emperor was not simply a ruler. He was a divine figure who could bring order to a universe filled with chaos and uncertainty. The Lectitio Divinitatus was also a vehicle for political power. As the cult of the emperor grew, it began to establish its own institutions, most notably the Ecclesiarchy, which would come to dominate religious life within the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy was not just a religious organization. It was an arm of the imperial bureaucracy that wielded immense political influence. By promoting the emperor's divinity, the Ecclesiarchy secured its own place in the Imperium's power structure, alongside the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperial Guard, and the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Lectitio Divinitatus was the foundation upon which the Ecclesiarchy would build its vast influence, and it was a tool for consolidating power not only for the emperor, but for the religious elite who would take his divine mantle and use it to manipulate the masses. However, it is important to note that the Lectitio Divinitatus was not universally accepted. Not everyone saw the emperor as a god, and many of the emperor's closest allies, such as his Primarchs, vehemently rejected the idea. The emperor himself also seemed to disavow the notion of his own divinity. In a famous speech, he declared that he was no god, and that to elevate him to such a status would be an insult to both humanity and reason. Yet, despite these proclamations, the doctrine of the Lectitio Divinitatus spread like wildfire, especially in the wake of the Horus Heresy, where the emperor's near-mortal wounds and his subsequent entombment in the Golden Throne seemed to validate the belief that he had transcended mere mortality. As the emperor's physical form deteriorated and the Imperium entered the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the doctrine of the Lectitio Divinitatus would become the central tenet of the imperial cult. The emperor was now worshipped as a god by billions, his divine image reinforced by the Ecclesiarchy and the imperial government. Yet, as the Imperium embraced its god, it also distanced itself from the truth of the emperor's nature. And this is where the story of the Lectitio Divinitatus becomes even more enigmatic. For somewhere along the line, the knowledge of the emperor's true nature, his purpose, and his plans for humanity became obscured. In the centuries following the Horus Heresy, much of the emperor's original teachings, intentions, and even the history of the Lectitio Divinitatus became lost or distorted. And in the midst of this process of erasure and obfuscation, certain parts of the Lectitio, the very words that might have provided clarity about the emperor's true nature, disappeared. Were these missing pages deliberately removed by the emperor himself, perhaps to protect the future of humanity from forbidden knowledge? Or were they erased by forces within the Imperium, such as the Inquisition, to prevent certain truths from coming to light? This is where the story of the missing pages takes on a darker and more mysterious tone. The loss of these pages is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It is a reflection of the Imperium's willingness to erase or control its own past to preserve the present narrative. The Lectitio Divinitatus, in its complete form, might have contained truths that were deemed too dangerous to be known. Perhaps the missing pages held knowledge of the Emperor's true plans for humanity, knowledge that would have revealed his intentions to guide humanity towards something greater than mere survival. Or perhaps those pages contained dark truths about the Emperor's connection to the warp, the forces of chaos, or the true nature of his psychic power. These secrets may have been seen as too dangerous, not only for the Imperium but for the Emperor himself, whose control over the Imperium relied on the belief in his divinity. To lose these pages was to lose a part of the Emperor's legacy, and with it, a part of humanity's future. The Emperor's rise to godhood in the eyes of the Imperium was not an easy or straightforward process. It was, in fact, a political and theological evolution, shaped by necessity, circumstances, and the shifting tides of war. While the Emperor himself rejected the idea of being worshipped as a deity, the rise of the Lectitio Divinitatus was inevitable. It was a religious movement that found fertile ground among the people of the Imperium who, after centuries of war and suffering, sought something to believe in, something that could give their lives meaning and hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Lectitio was more than just a religious movement. It became a rallying cry, an identity for the Imperium as it forged ahead in its war against the enemies of mankind. Before the rise of the Lectitio Divinitatus, humanity had experienced millennia of strife. The age of strife had left countless worlds shattered and adrift in isolation. Wars between factions, internal strife, and the spread of heretical ideologies had all but destroyed the unity of mankind. The Emperor's Great Crusade was meant to bring an end to this chaos and restore humanity to its rightful place as rulers of the galaxy. Yet, despite his incredible power and wisdom, the Emperor's mission was not universally embraced. His ideals of secularism, reason, and unity, while noble, were not enough to fully unite humanity under his banner. Many of the Emperor's closest allies, including his Primarchs and the Adeptus Astartes, did not believe in the need for the Emperor to be seen as a god. To them, he was a man, a brilliant, unparalleled leader, yes, but a man all the same. Yet, to many others, particularly the people of the worlds liberated by the Great Crusade, the Emperor was something more. He was a beacon of hope, a figure of near mythical proportions. It was among these masses that the idea of the Emperor as a god began to take root. The Lectitio Divinitatus was not simply the work of a single individual or group. It was a grassroots movement born out of the need for something greater, something that transcended the struggles of day-to-day life. For the Emperor's followers, his presence and power were so overwhelming that they could not conceive of him as anything but divine. The Lectitio began to take shape as a way to formalize and codify this belief, turning it into a doctrine that could be spread across the Imperium. It was a belief that gave people something to hold on to in the dark corners of the galaxy, where the light of the Emperor was a distant but necessary hope. But while the Lectitio Divinitatus gained traction in many parts of the Imperium, it was not without its critics, particularly within the Emperor's inner circle. The Primarchs, the Emperor's most trusted sons, were largely opposed to the idea of their father being deified. They saw the Emperor as a godlike figure, but not as a deity in the traditional sense. To them, the Emperor was not a god to be worshipped, but a leader to be respected, a figure who embodied the highest ideals of humanity, but was still very much human. The Emperor himself, too, rejected the idea of divinity, stating that he was not a god but a man who had transcended the limitations of humanity through sheer willpower and intellect. Yet, despite the Emperor's proclamations, the Lectitio Divinitatus continued to grow. It was not just a religious movement, but a political one as well. The idea of the Emperor as a god provided a unifying force for the disparate worlds of the Imperium, many of which were still struggling with the fallout of the Age of Strife. In a galaxy filled with alien horrors, warp storms, and the constant threat of chaos, the idea that the Emperor was a divine being offered solace to those who needed it most. It gave them something to rally behind, something to believe in when the universe seemed unrelentingly hostile. The Lectitio Divinitatus was also a tool of political power. Those who embraced the belief in the Emperor's divinity often found themselves in positions of influence, able to manipulate the masses by invoking the Emperor's name. The Ecclesiarchy, the religious institution that would later become the heart of the imperial cult, was born out of this movement. The Ecclesiarchy's leaders saw the Lectitio as a means to consolidate their own power within the Imperium, to control the spiritual life of humanity and shape the narrative of the emperor's reign. Over time, the Ecclesiarchy would become a powerful institution, one that would control not just religion, but also vast swaths of the Imperium's politics, culture, and military. As the years passed, the belief in the emperor's divinity became more entrenched, especially after the Horus Heresy. The emperor's near-mortal wounding and his subsequent internment within the Golden Throne, an ancient life support system that kept him alive, only reinforced the belief that the emperor had transcended mortality. To the people of the Imperium, the emperor's continued existence in the form of the Golden Throne was seen as proof of his divinity. And yet, the emperor himself, in his post-heresy state, was unable to publicly reject this idea. His inability to speak, combined with the overwhelming power of the Ecclesiarchy, ensured that the emperor would be worshipped as a god for millennia. This political and religious shift was not without its consequences. The Lectitio Divinitatus gave birth to a doctrine that would become the backbone of the Imperium's faith, but it also contributed to the increasing authoritarianism and rigidity of imperial society. As the emperor was elevated to godhood, the Imperium itself began to solidify into a monolithic, dogmatic entity that valued blind obedience above reason. The worship of the emperor as a god became a means of control, both over the masses and over the elites of the Imperium. The emperor was no longer a man of reason, but a divine, infallible being whose will was unquestionable. Yet despite the centrality of the emperor's divinity to the Imperium's functioning, the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus remind us that the origins of the emperor's godhood were far more complex and ambiguous. These missing pages could have contained insights into the emperor's true intentions, revealing a deeper understanding of his purpose and goals for humanity. They could have shed light on the emperor's feelings toward his own deification, and whether he had any role in the promotion of his divinity. In the absence of this knowledge, we are left with only speculation, and the mystery of the Lectitio Divinitatus remains unsolved, its lost pages forever haunting the Imperium. The Inquisition, the shadowy, powerful arm of the Imperium, is both protector and manipulator, using its vast influence to shape the future of humanity according to its own vision. As the Lectitio Divinitatus spread, the Inquisition grew ever more concerned with the potential dangers inherent in the idea of the emperor as a god. The very nature of the Lectitio was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided the Imperium with unity and purpose, but on the other, it created a dangerous framework that could be exploited by those with more radical ideas. The emperor's transformation into a deity was not universally accepted by the forces of the Imperium, and there were many within the Inquisition who saw the growing religious fervor as a potential threat to the stability of the Imperium itself. The Inquisition's role in the suppression of knowledge cannot be overstated. It was, in many ways, the keeper of forbidden truths, controlling the flow of information to the masses to maintain order and prevent heresy. This is where the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus come into play. The Inquisition was known to suppress or destroy knowledge deemed dangerous or subversive to the imperial truth, and it is entirely plausible that the missing pages of the Lectitio were erased or concealed by the Inquisition in an effort to maintain control over the Imperium's religious narrative. In the wake of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium entered a period of extreme paranoia and isolation. The fall of Horus and the betrayal of the emperor by one of his most trusted sons shook the very foundations of the Imperium, and the Inquisition was tasked with ensuring that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The Lectitio Divinitatus, now fully entrenched as the doctrine of the imperial cult, was seen by the Inquisition as a necessary tool to keep humanity united. Yet, they were also deeply suspicious of any deviation from the official narrative of the emperor's divinity. The Inquisition sought to eliminate any traces of heresy, and this would have included any records or teachings that contradicted the accepted view of the emperor as a god. The idea that the Inquisition played a direct role in the removal or destruction of the missing pages from the Lectitio Divinitatus is not without merit. The Inquisition is known for its ruthlessness when it comes to eradicating dangerous ideas, and the missing pages could easily have been seen as a potential threat to the stability of the Imperium. These pages, whatever knowledge they contained, might have revealed uncomfortable truths about the Emperor or the true nature of the Imperium. If the Emperor had not intended to be worshipped as a god, then the Lectitio Divinitatus could have been viewed as a fabrication, a product of misguided followers, or, worse, a deliberate attempt to manipulate humanity into blind obedience. The Inquisition's suppression of this knowledge would, therefore, be seen as a way to preserve the status quo, ensuring that the Emperor's divinity was unquestioned and that the Ecclesiarchy retained its hold over the Imperium's religious life. It is also worth considering the role that the Adeptus Mechanicus might have played in the erasure of the missing pages. The Mechanicus, with its deep understanding of both technology and arcane knowledge, had a vested interest in maintaining the Emperor's image as a god. To the Mechanicus, the Emperor's divinity was not just a religious matter. It was also a matter of technology, control, and power. The Emperor's life support system, the Golden Throne, was a symbol of his godlike status, and the Mechanicus would have been keen to protect this image at all costs. If the missing pages of the Lectitio contained knowledge that could undermine the Emperor's divine status or expose inconvenient truths, the Mechanicus might have worked in concert with the Inquisition to suppress them. The Lectitio Divinitatus was not just a religious document, it was a tool of power, and the Inquisition was keenly aware of how dangerous it could be if it fell into the wrong hands. The Emperor's true nature and his plans for the future of humanity were shrouded in mystery, and it is entirely possible that the missing pages of the Lectitio held the key to understanding those secrets. The Inquisition's role in maintaining the imperial truth is essential to understanding why these pages may have been lost. In a galaxy where even the smallest hint of dissent or heresy could unravel everything, the Inquisition's actions were, in their view, justified. But in doing so, they ensured that a part of humanity's past and the future of the Emperor's legacy was forever lost. In the end, the Inquisition's involvement in the destruction or suppression of the Lectitio Divinitatus's missing pages serves to highlight the complex relationship between knowledge, power, and control in the Imperium. The Inquisition, while often viewed as the protectors of humanity from the forces of chaos and heresy, are also the gatekeepers of imperial truth. Their actions, while necessary in their eyes, contributed to the mystification of the Emperor's true purpose and the distortion of the history of the Imperium. The Lectitio Divinitatus, in its incomplete form, is a document of immense power, one that could have potentially altered the course of humanity's future had its full content been preserved. But instead, it remains a tool of the Inquisition. Its missing pages, a symbol of the Imperium's constant struggle to control its own narrative and maintain its fragile unity. The Ecclesiarchy, the religious arm of the Imperium, stands as one of the most powerful institutions in the galaxy. Through its unwavering commitment to the Emperor's worship, it has shaped the faith of billions of citizens, binding them together under the banner of the imperial cult. As the enforcer of the Lectitio Divinitatus, the Ecclesiarchy has maintained the doctrine of the Emperor's divinity for millennia, using its vast reach to ensure that all within the Imperium adhere to the official narrative of the Emperor as a god. But what role did the Ecclesiarchy play in the creation, propagation, and eventual destruction of the Lectitio Divinitatus missing pages? Was it simply an innocent bystander in the erasure of this knowledge, or did it have a hand in ensuring certain truths were hidden from the people of the Imperium? The rise of the Ecclesiarchy as a major force within the Imperium is intrinsically tied to the spread of the Lectitio Divinitatus. In the early days, the Emperor's personal rejection of divine worship left the religious development of the Imperium in a precarious state. The Lectitio Divinitatus was a spontaneous movement, rising from the people's fervent belief in the Emperor's divinity, but it lacked structure. As a result, it was vulnerable to the whims of various factions, each seeking to influence or control the emperor's image for their own ends. The Ecclesiarchy emerged in response to this, acting as the institutional force that would codify the worship of the emperor and consolidate it into an official doctrine. With the Ecclesiarchy's rise to power, the Lectitio Divinitatus became central to the religious life of the Imperium. The emperor's divinity was no longer a subject of debate. It was an unassailable truth, established by the Lectitio and supported by the religious institution that controlled faith across the Imperium. The Ecclesiarchy's role in this process was multifaceted. It didn't merely promote the idea of the emperor as a god, it was actively involved in shaping the doctrine of the imperial cult. The religious elite, through their control of sacred texts and the dissemination of knowledge, ensured that the people of the Imperium were taught that the emperor was the divine protector of humanity. This manipulation of religious thought served to keep the Imperium unified under one faith and one purpose. The question arises then, whether the Ecclesiarchy had any involvement in the removal or destruction of the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus. Given its vested interest in maintaining the power of the emperor's cult, it is entirely plausible that the Ecclesiarchy could have been complicit in erasing any content that could undermine the emperor's divinity, or more critically, destabilize the foundation of the Ecclesiarchy's power. The Ecclesiarchy was not a benign organization. It wielded enormous influence, and its leaders were not above manipulating or destroying knowledge that threatened their control over the Imperium. The Lectitio Divinitatus itself could have contained sections that questioned the divinity of the emperor, or perhaps that pointed to the emperor's true purpose. The emperor's personal views on divinity were not always clear, and it is possible that he had never intended to be worshipped in such a way. Could the missing pages have included teachings from the emperor himself, perhaps casting doubt on the necessity of worshipping him as a god? If so, the Ecclesiarchy, with its immense power and influence, would have had a significant interest in ensuring such knowledge was erased. After all, the emperor's godhood was central to their authority. If the true nature of the emperor were ever revealed, that he was not a god but a mere man, or worse, that he was never meant to be deified, then the Ecclesiarchy's entire position would collapse. Their power was based on the emperor's status as a divine being, and the potential loss of this image would have been catastrophic for them. Moreover, the Lectitio Divinitatus served the Ecclesiarchy not only as a spiritual document, but also as a tool of political control. By controlling the narrative of the emperor's divinity, the Ecclesiarchy was able to wield immense influence over the imperial bureaucracy, military, and citizenry. The emperor was the unquestionable god of mankind, and anyone who dared to challenge that notion was branded a heretic. The Ecclesiarchy's ability to manipulate faith and religious doctrine gave it unparalleled authority within the Imperium. The missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus may have contained inconvenient truths that threatened to upset this fragile balance. If those pages detailed the emperor's rejection of divinity, or if they exposed the truth about the emperor's nature, then they would have represented a dangerous threat to the Ecclesiarchy's very existence. It is highly likely, then, that the Ecclesiarchy would have acted to suppress this knowledge. The destruction or concealment of these pages would not have been a decision made lightly. The Ecclesiarchy was fully aware of the power of knowledge and how it could shape the future of the Imperium. They understood that any information that questioned the emperor's godhood would have the potential to fracture the belief system that kept the Imperium together. The idea of the emperor as a god was more than just a religious doctrine. It was the foundation of the Imperium's unity. Without the emperor's divinity, the entire structure of the Imperium would be weakened. The Ecclesiarchy, therefore, would have taken any steps necessary to protect this belief, including the erasure of parts of the Lectitio Divinitatus that could sow doubt. The missing pages are not merely a mystery, they are a symbol of the tension between knowledge and control, between truth and power. The Ecclesiarchy's role in shaping the religious narrative of the Imperium is undeniable, and their willingness to manipulate or destroy knowledge that threatens their position is well documented. The Lectitio Divinitatus, in its full form, could have contained knowledge that changed the course of the Imperium's history. Knowledge that was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. And in the end, the Ecclesiarchy's actions ensured that only one version of the truth would prevail. The one that kept the Emperor firmly seated on his golden throne, a god above all. But what if the missing pages contained something more? What if they held a message from the Emperor himself, perhaps a final directive or warning that could have reshaped the fate of the Imperium? In the end, the Ecclesiarchy's determination to control the narrative of the Emperor's divinity led to the erasure of truths that may never be known, leaving only the myths and legends that continue to shape the Imperium today. The Emperor of Mankind, in his tragic and heroic struggle to unite humanity under a single banner, was a visionary, a leader, and a tyrant, all wrapped into one. His intent was not simply to conquer the galaxy, but to forge a unified, rational, and scientific future for humanity, free from the religious superstitions that had plagued mankind for millennia. However, despite the Emperor's lofty ideals, the rise of the Lectitio Divinitatus marked a turning point, one that would transform him from the supreme ruler of mankind into a god in the eyes of billions. This transition, however, was not without consequences. The political power gained by the Lectitio Divinitatus and its subsequent institutionalization within the Ecclesiarchy would become one of the Imperium's most crucial driving forces. But was this religious shift truly inevitable? Or was it a political maneuver to consolidate power that ultimately outlived its original intent? The transformation of the Emperor into a god was not something the Emperor himself sought. In fact, during the early stages of the Great Crusade, the Emperor was deeply opposed to the very notion of being worshipped. He was a pragmatist, a man of reason and science, not one to indulge in superstition. His ultimate goal was the expansion of the Imperium based on secular principles, where the Emperor was seen as a protector of humanity and an unparalleled strategist, but not as a divine being. In his eyes, to elevate himself to godhood was not only an insult to reason, but also a betrayal of his principles. The Emperor was not a god. He was an ascended human being who had transcended the limits of mortal existence through intellect, will, and sheer determination. Yet, in the far reaches of the Imperium, the idea of the Emperor as a god began to take root. The Lectitio Divinitatus, a religious movement that arose out of the Emperor's deeds and the awe he inspired in his followers, sought to elevate him to divine status. It was not a movement that had originated from the Emperor's desires, but rather from the needs of humanity. In the wake of the Great Crusade, the worlds liberated by the Emperor were desperate for meaning, and they found it in the idea of a living god leading them. The Emperor, whose presence was a symbol of unity and hope, was cast in the role of a divine figure, and thus, the first seeds of the imperial cult were sown. This elevation of the Emperor to godhood would have profound political implications. The belief in the Emperor as a god would serve not only as a unifying force, but as a tool of political consolidation. As the worship of the Emperor spread, so did the influence of those who controlled the religious narrative. The Ecclesiarchy, as the institution tasked with preserving and propagating the Emperor's divinity, would eventually gain enormous power within the Imperium. The Emperor's divinity would become a central tenet of imperial identity, a belief that bound the citizens of the Imperium together and gave the ruling elite a powerful means of control. The political implications of the Emperor's godhood were particularly evident during the tumultuous days of the Horus Heresy. The heresy itself was a rebellion not only against the Emperor's authority, but against the very structure of the Imperium. Horus, once the Emperor's most trusted son, turned against him, seeking to overthrow the Imperium and remake it in his own image. It was during this time that the Emperor's divinity was tested like never before. The heresy caused the Emperor's image to fracture. While some saw him as a god who could do no wrong, others viewed him as a failed ruler who had allowed his own sons to rebel against him. In the aftermath of the heresy, the Emperor's body was placed within the Golden Throne, an elaborate life support system designed to keep his shattered form alive. The Emperor, who had once rejected the idea of godhood, was now effectively worshipped as a god by billions. His image became the cornerstone of the imperial faith, and the Ecclesiarchy wielded immense power, reinforcing the emperor's divinity at every turn. However, the Lectitio Divinitatus and the subsequent rise of the imperial cult also helped solidify the political structure of the imperium. The emperor, now a god in the eyes of the faithful, became a symbol of unity. His divine status gave legitimacy to the ruling powers within the imperium, and his worship became the basis for political control. Yet, the truth about the emperor's role in his own deification remained buried. Was the emperor complicit in his own worship, or was the rise of the imperial cult something that happened despite his intentions? The missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus may have held the answers to this question, offering insights into the emperor's true feelings about his deification. Could it be that the emperor, in his infinite wisdom, allowed the cult to take shape as a means of consolidating the imperium's power, even if it meant sacrificing his original ideals? Or was the rise of the imperial cult a corruption of his vision, a tragedy brought about by the very forces of chaos and war that he had sought to eliminate? What the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus might have revealed is the key to understanding the deep contradictions at the heart of the imperium. The emperor's rise to godhood was not a simple religious or theological event. It was a political maneuver, a tool for uniting humanity under the banner of the imperium. In this context, the missing pages could have contained crucial information about the emperor's original intent and his views on his own worship. If the pages had survived, they might have clarified whether the emperor ever intended to be seen as a god, or whether his deification was an unfortunate consequence of the chaos of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Lectitio Divinitatus was not just a religious text, it was a political one as well. Its creation, evolution, and eventual destruction are a reflection of the imperium's struggle to maintain control, both spiritually and politically. The emperor's divinity was, and still is, a tool of power, wielded by the Ecclesiarchy and the ruling elite. In the absence of the missing pages, we are left with only half of the story, a tale of a god whose true nature remains elusive. What secrets were lost with those pages? What truths were hidden from the people of the imperium? And what might the imperium look like today if those truths had been revealed? Speculation about the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus naturally invites a broad range of possibilities, each one more tantalizing than the last. As the Lectitio played such a crucial role in shaping the religious and political landscape of the imperium, the implications of these missing sections could have reshaped the understanding of the emperor's role in history, his true purpose, and the future of humanity itself. For all the speculation, the lost knowledge is as much about what remains hidden as it is about the uncomfortable truths the imperium may never be ready to face. What exactly was contained on those missing pages? This question, though unanswerable through definitive lore, sparks vivid imaginations and invites myriad fan theories. A compelling possibility is that the missing sections were concerned with the true nature of the emperor's psychic abilities, his purpose, and his personal vision for humanity's future. These pages may have offered a glimpse into the deeper, more arcane aspects of the emperor's powers, especially in relation to the warp and the chaos gods, information that would have been too dangerous or subversive for the imperium to retain. One of the most fascinating ideas posits that the missing pages may have contained an explanation of the emperor's original intentions. Before his near-mortal wounding and entombment on the Golden Throne, the emperor sought a rational, scientific future for humanity, free from superstition, free from the manipulative forces of the warp. If the Lectitio Divinitatus were complete, perhaps it would have revealed that the emperor intended humanity to transcend the need for worship and instead embrace reason and scientific progress. Instead, the rise of the imperial cult, a deeply religious movement that demanded the emperor be worshipped as a god, directly contradicted his vision. Were the missing pages a warning from the emperor himself? It is possible that he foresaw the dangers of deification and attempted to write down his true thoughts, perhaps advising humanity to reject the path that would ultimately lead them to blind worship. The Emperor, who saw himself as a guardian of mankind's future, might have known that the cult of the Emperor, while uniting humanity, would eventually stifle the intellectual and technological growth that he had envisioned. The missing pages could have contained a final plea for humanity to stay true to the values of rationalism and progress, to never let faith override reason. If such pages existed, and the Emperor truly did warn against his own deification, then their destruction or erasure was a devastating blow to the understanding of the Emperor's true legacy. Alternatively, there is the theory that the missing pages could have been linked to a more esoteric aspect of the Emperor's existence: his connection to the warp. The Emperor's psychic power is one of the defining characteristics of his being, and while much has been said about his psychic strength, the truth of how he interacts with the warp remains elusive. Could the missing pages have contained information about the Emperor's role in the larger cosmic balance between the forces of the warp, the chaos gods, and humanity itself? The Emperor's original plan was to protect humanity from the dangers of chaos, to ensure that mankind could flourish without falling prey to the predations of the dark gods. But over time, this mission became distorted, and the Emperor was entombed in the Golden Throne, a living corpse whose connection to the warp has been twisted into something that perpetuates a never-ending cycle of suffering. In this scenario, the Lectitio Divinitatus could have held knowledge that explained the Emperor's fate in relation to the warp. Perhaps the missing pages revealed that the Emperor had always known the price of his grand plan, that to safeguard humanity's future, he would have to sacrifice his own physical form, leaving behind only a fragmented, godlike image. This would mean that the Emperor's godhood was not merely an accident of history, but a necessary evolution in the cosmic struggle against the forces of chaos, a sacrifice that came at a great personal cost. The pages could have described how the Emperor's soul, through the Golden Throne, became a tether between the mortal realm and the realm of the warp, ensuring humanity's protection at a terrible price. Another intriguing possibility lies in the role of the Emperor's own sons, the Primarchs, in the Lectitio Divinitatus. The loss of the missing pages may have tied directly into the Emperor's complex relationship with his sons, some of whom embraced the idea of his divinity, while others rejected it outright. The pages could have been an attempt to clarify the Emperor's intentions toward his sons, or to explain the deeper, hidden truths about their roles within the Imperium. What if the missing sections contained something about the Emperor's knowledge of the Horus Heresy before it happened, or perhaps a vision of what might have been had Horus not fallen? The Emperor's decision to elevate himself to godhood may have been a response to the perceived failure of his sons to fully comprehend or support his vision. The missing pages could have held crucial details about the Emperor's understanding of his sons' potential and their ultimate betrayal. However, there is a darker theory, one that aligns with the twisted nature of the Warhammer 40k universe. What if the missing pages were deliberately erased by the Emperor or his closest followers in order to hide the truth from the masses? Perhaps the Emperor, with his unparalleled wisdom, realized that revealing certain truths would have caused irrevocable damage to humanity's fragile unity. It is possible that the Emperor knew of his own failings, or even of the corrupted nature of his ultimate plan for mankind. These missing pages could have contained a bitter truth: that the Emperor's attempts to save humanity had been flawed from the start, and that in his efforts to safeguard the future, he had doomed humanity to an endless cycle of suffering and stagnation. This idea suggests that the missing pages were not a tragic loss, but a deliberate act of preservation. In the face of the overwhelming forces of chaos and the inevitable fall of the Imperium, the Emperor and his closest allies may have decided that some truths were simply too dangerous to share. To reveal the truth about the Emperor's fallibility, or about the dark nature of the Imperium's future, might have caused the collapse of the Imperium long before its time. The concept of the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus represents far more than an incomplete document. It symbolizes the fractured nature of the Imperium's history and the deep contradictions at the heart of its existence. The loss of these pages is a tragedy, not just for the Imperium, but for all of humanity. In erasing these secrets, the Imperium has denied itself a chance to confront its true past and its uncertain future. The missing pages could have provided the answers to some of the greatest questions in the Warhammer 40k universe. Answers that remain just beyond reach, buried in the dust of time. The tragedy of the missing pages from the Lectitio Divinitatus is not simply about lost knowledge, but about the deep, unsettling implications this loss holds for the Imperium of man. The very foundation of the Imperium, its identity, and its eternal struggle against chaos are built upon the deification of the Emperor. But as time has passed, the truth behind this deification has become obscured, veiled by the very faith that sustained it. The Emperor, once a godlike figure, is now an almost mythical being, entombed in the Golden Throne, his physical form slowly decaying. Yet even in his death, his godhood continues to shape the Imperium, as his followers desperately cling to the belief that their god, though silent and distant, is still watching over them. The Lectitio Divinitatus, while not without its flaws and contradictions, served as the bedrock for the Ecclesiarchy's rule over the Imperium. Its message, though distorted over the millennia, is one of unyielding faith in the Emperor. The missing pages, however, represent a void in history, a gap that humanity cannot fill. These lost sections may have contained the key to unlocking the true nature of the Emperor's divinity, or even his original intentions. Were the missing pages the Emperor's last will, written to reveal his final thoughts? Did they contain a cautionary message, warning humanity about the dangers of blind faith and the consequences of idolizing their ruler? Or were they, as some believe, filled with the Emperor's recognition that humanity's salvation lay in a different path, one not reliant on his godhood? We are left with nothing but theories and conjecture, and this uncertainty permeates the very fabric of the Imperium's belief. The Lectitio Divinitatus as it stands today is a distorted reflection of the Emperor's original vision. It has been warped by time, by the Inquisition, by the Ecclesiarchy, and by the forces of chaos. The truth, buried in the missing pages, remains an enigma, a mystery that may never be solved. For the people of the Imperium, the Emperor is a god, and that belief fuels their unwavering loyalty to the Imperium's cause. But what if they were wrong? What if the Emperor's message, had it been fully understood, would have led humanity down a different path, one that was not marked by endless war, suffering, and the worship of a fallen god? The Lectitio Divinitatus and its missing pages encapsulate the Imperium's tragic flaw, a refusal to confront the truth. The Imperium has built an empire on a myth, and to uncover the truth behind the Lectitio would be to unravel the very fabric of the Imperium's existence. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, knowledge is power, and sometimes ignorance can be a weapon. The missing pages may never be recovered, and perhaps that is for the best. For if the truth were to be revealed, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Emperor may have intended humanity to transcend his godhood, but now, after millennia of devotion, the Lectitio Divinitatus stands as an unshakable pillar of the Imperium's faith. Yet, the mystery remains. Perhaps the answers lie buried in forgotten vaults, locked away by the Inquisition or the Ecclesiarchy, fearful of what might happen if the truth were ever revealed. Or perhaps, as is so often the case in the universe of Warhammer 40k, the truth is lost to the ages, and all that remains are the legends and the myths. What was on those missing pages? We may never know. But the very act of wondering about them is a reflection of the deep yearning for answers that defines the Imperium itself. The Lectitio Divinitatus may be incomplete, but in its mystery, it is also a mirror of the Imperium, forever searching, forever fighting, and forever lost in the dark shadows of its past. As we conclude this exploration of the Lectitio Divinitatus and the missing pages, it's a reminder of how much remains hidden in the galaxy. The Imperium, while vast and powerful, is a fractured entity, built on a foundation of faith, myth, and political manipulation. The true nature of the Emperor, the full content of the Lectitio, and the secrets of the past remain out of reach, tantalizingly close but eternally elusive. In the end, perhaps that is the tragedy of the Imperium itself. Caught in an endless cycle of belief, never able to truly understand the nature of its past or the meaning of its existence. The idea of the Lectitio Divinitatus is as much a product of its time as it is a tool of long-term manipulation. The fact that the missing pages of the Lectitio remain lost to history is both tragic and revealing. They represent not just forgotten words, but the potential unraveling of an entire belief system. The deeper one delves into the mystery of the Lectitio Divinitatus, the more one realizes that it is not merely about the Emperor's divinity, it's about the very foundation upon which the Imperium is built. The Lectitio serves as a means of controlling a society that is fundamentally fractured, a society that was never truly united, even under the Emperor's rule. Its very existence points to an uncomfortable truth. The Imperium, despite its immense power, is held together by faith rather than by reason, and its long-term survival depends on the collective adherence to a myth that may not even be true. In many ways, the Lectitio Divinitatus reflects the tragic duality of the Imperium itself. It is an institution that, on the one hand, demands the unquestioning faith of its people, and on the other, hides its own history from them. The missing pages of the Lectitio might have been more than just lost knowledge. They could have been a catalyst for the Imperium's unraveling. If those pages had been recovered, if the Emperor's true thoughts had been revealed, what would that mean for the people who have lived their lives worshipping a god they barely understand? Could they continue to fight and die for a belief that may not have been the Emperor's will? Could the Imperium as a whole continue to function if the very foundation of its faith was torn away, exposing the cracks beneath? It's important to recognize that the Lectitio Divinitatus wasn't just a doctrine of faith, it was a vehicle for power. The Emperor's divinity was not just about creating a unified religion, but also about controlling the masses. Throughout history, religion has been a tool of control, used to consolidate power and manipulate populations. The Emperor's godhood, as presented in the Lectitio, allowed the ruling elite of the Imperium, the Ecclesiarchy, the Adeptus Terra, and the Imperium's governors, to maintain an iron grip on humanity. By perpetuating the myth of the Emperor as a god, they ensured that any resistance would be seen not only as heresy, but as a direct challenge to the very foundation of the Imperium's existence. It's easy to forget, in the grimdark future of the 41st millennium, that the Emperor was once a being of incredible intellect and power. His ambitions were rooted in a desire to uplift humanity, to guide it toward a future free from superstition and war. But as time passed, that vision became distorted. What began as a rational scientific mission eventually morphed into a militarized religious empire in which the Emperor was worshipped as a god. This shift, this corruption, was inevitable in a universe as hostile as the one humanity inhabited. In a galaxy beset by Xenos threats, warp storms, and the ever-looming shadow of chaos, faith became a means of survival. The Emperor, though still revered as a genius and a protector, was deified by the very people he sought to lead to a better future. The Lectitio Divinitatus played a central role in this transformation, turning a brilliant leader into a celestial being, one whose every word and deed was scrutinized for divine meaning. Yet, the Lectitio Divinitatus was not a product of the Emperor's will alone. It arose organically from the hearts of the people who worshipped him. As the Emperor led the Great Crusade, humanity came to see him not just as a ruler, but as a force of nature. The Emperor's towering intellect and unmatched ability to unite the fractured remnants of humanity inspired awe and reverence in those who followed him. For many, the Emperor became more than a man. He became a symbol of hope in a galaxy that seemed perpetually on the brink of annihilation. Over time, this reverence was codified into doctrine, eventually becoming the Lectitio Divinitatus. However, the Lectitio's teachings did not remain free from corruption. The rise of the Ecclesiarchy, with its institutionalization of the Emperor's divinity, transformed the faith into a political tool. The ecclesiastical structure was designed to provide legitimacy to the Imperium's rulers, with the Emperor's divinity acting as the ultimate justification for the Imperium's warlike and authoritarian nature. The Ecclesiarchy became the official guardian of the Lectitio Divinitatus, controlling access to its teachings and ensuring that the Emperor's godhood remained unchallenged. It is within this context that the missing pages of the Lectitio take on their true significance. If the Lectitio was truly a reflection of the Emperor's will, then the removal of the missing pages could be seen as an act of deliberate obfuscation. Perhaps these pages contained material that contradicted the Ecclesiarchy's carefully constructed narrative, material that questioned the emperor's divinity or the righteousness of his cause. If so, their removal would be an act of preserving the Imperium's fragile unity, ensuring that no one would ever question the emperor's status as a god. The truth, however, may be more complicated. Perhaps the missing pages contain the emperor's true thoughts on the matter. The knowledge that he was never truly a god, but a man who had transcended the limitations of his mortal form. This would not be an outright rejection of divinity, but rather a complex reflection on the nature of humanity's need for belief. The emperor, in his infinite wisdom, may have realized that humanity could never evolve into a rational, secular society as he had once envisioned. Perhaps, as the Lectitio began to spread, he saw that the only way to ensure humanity's survival was through faith, even if that meant sacrificing his own vision for the future. The missing pages could have provided this insight, and if they did, then the Ecclesiarchy's erasure of them would be a calculated decision, one made to preserve the religious narrative of the emperor's divinity. Yet, there's a darker possibility that cannot be ignored. What if the missing pages were erased to hide something far more sinister? The emperor's connection to the warp has always been a point of intrigue, and the Lectitio Divinitatus could have contained knowledge about the emperor's true purpose in relation to the warp. It is widely believed that the emperor was the architect of the Astronomicon, the beacon that guides the ships of the Imperium through the warp. However, the emperor's true nature, his connection to the chaos gods, and his ultimate role in the cosmic struggle remains shrouded in mystery. The missing pages of the Lectitio might have revealed this connection, perhaps exposing the emperor's deeper ties to the forces of the warp. Such a revelation would have had catastrophic consequences, not only for the faith of the Imperium, but for the very foundation of humanity's fight against chaos. In the absence of these lost pages, the Imperium remains locked in a state of ignorance, its people trapped in a cycle of belief that may no longer serve them. The Ecclesiarchy continues to wield power, its influence unquestioned, and the emperor's godhood remains the central pillar of the Imperium's identity. But in the quiet corners of the galaxy, there are those who question the narrative. They seek the truth, digging through ancient ruins and hidden archives, hoping to uncover the missing knowledge. Some are heretics, others are simply curious, but all are driven by the same desire: to know the truth behind the emperor's divinity. The search for the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus may never yield answers, but in the end, it represents the Imperium's greatest tragedy. The truth remains just out of reach, and perhaps it always will. The mystery of the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus reveals much about the relationship between faith and power within the Imperium of Man. As one of the oldest and most influential documents in Imperial history, the Lectitio encapsulates the beliefs that have shaped the entire galaxy-spanning empire. Its message has served to unify billions under the Emperor's divine banner. Yet that unity is fragile, held together by belief and by the ecclesiastical structures that perpetuate it. The loss of those missing pages may be seen as a reflection of the Imperium's greatest weakness, its inability to truly understand the nature of the Emperor and its own place in the galaxy. The Lectitio Divinitatus is more than a religious text. It is the foundation of the Imperium's identity, and the secrets lost within its missing pages are a symbol of the distance between the truth and what the Imperium believes to be true. To understand the full weight of this loss, we must consider the context in which the Lectitio was born. It was written in the aftermath of the Emperor's unification of humanity during the Great Crusade, a time when humanity was still reeling from the horrors of the Age of Strife and the early days of the Imperium's expansion. The Emperor was a figure of hope, a beacon of reason, and a symbol of mankind's potential. But as his empire grew, so too did the reverence for him. The Emperor's power and presence inspired awe, and for many, the idea that such a figure could be anything less than divine seemed impossible. And so, the seeds of the Lectitio Divinitatus were planted. The Lectitio was not the Emperor's creation. In fact, he rejected the idea of being worshipped as a god. He was, in his own words, no more than a man who had risen above the limitations of mortality. But in a galaxy where humanity had spent millennia mired in superstition and religious conflict, the idea of a godlike emperor provided an irresistible unifying force. For the people of the Imperium, the emperor's image as a god became an essential tool of cohesion, binding together disparate worlds and warring factions under a single banner. The doctrine of the Lectitio Divinitatus emerged from this need, not from the emperor's will, but from the masses' desire for something greater than themselves to believe in. The Lectitio's influence spread rapidly, especially among the lower classes and those far from the emperor's direct reach. It became a movement of faith, one that transcended reason and embraced the idea of the emperor as a divine protector. But for the elites, the ruling class, the military leaders, and the emperor's closest advisors, the Lectitio represented a growing threat to their authority. The emperor's rejection of divinity had always been clear, but the rise of the Lectitio brought with it the possibility of destabilizing the emperor's secular power. If the emperor were truly a god, then his word and will would take on a different significance. The Imperium's leaders would no longer be able to exercise their power through reason alone. They would be beholden to the emperor's supposed divine will. This tension between secular and religious power would become a defining feature of the Imperium's history. The emperor, despite his personal wishes, could not prevent the rise of the Lectitio Divinitatus, for the movement had grown too powerful. The emperor's image as a god was too valuable to the people who sought meaning in the midst of the galaxy's unrelenting chaos. The Lectitio became the cornerstone of the Ecclesiarchy, the religious body tasked with overseeing the worship of the emperor. And while the emperor's true thoughts on his divinity were kept hidden, the Ecclesiarchy and other institutions within the Imperium understood that their own power was closely tied to the emperor's godhood. Yet, as with all things in the Imperium, the rise of the Lectitio Divinitatus was not without its problems. The faith in the emperor's divinity became institutionalized, and with it came a loss of the emperor's original vision. The emperor had long been a proponent of unity through reason and science, and he had hoped to guide humanity toward a future where superstition was no longer necessary. But the very religion that was meant to solidify humanity's future instead shackled it to a mythic past. As the Lectitio spread, it became increasingly clear that the emperor's divinity was not merely a tool of political consolidation, it was the bedrock of the Imperium's identity, a force that would shape the fate of the galaxy for millennia. In this context, the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus represent not just a loss of knowledge, but a tragedy of perception. These pages might have held the keys to understanding the emperor's true nature, his ultimate vision, and the reason behind his rejection of godhood. They might have revealed the truth about the emperor's role in the creation of the Lectitio, and whether his followers had misunderstood his intentions or manipulated them for their own gain. The missing pages could have offered insight into the emperor's ultimate purpose, which may have been far more complex and nuanced than the simple idea of a divine protector. One possible theory is that these missing pages contained the emperor's final thoughts on the matter of his divinity. Did the emperor, in his last moments of clarity, offer a message of caution, warning humanity against the dangers of blind faith? Or did he, in some tragic moment of realization, acknowledge that humanity's only hope lay in his worship? The idea that the missing pages could contain such a revelation is both haunting and poignant. The emperor's vision for humanity was never about the worship of a deity. It was about the pursuit of knowledge, reason, and unity. But could his ultimate sacrifice, lying in a state of perpetual death within the Golden Throne, have become the catalyst for the very religious fervor he had sought to avoid? Another possibility is that the missing pages were not about the emperor's rejection of divinity, but instead about the emperor's own understanding of his role in the galaxy. It is well known that the emperor believed that humanity was on the precipice of an ascension beyond mere mortality, a transcendence that would have eliminated the need for religious worship. Yet, the very rise of the Lectitio suggests that, in the face of chaos and war, Humanity may have found itself clinging to superstition in the absence of true understanding. The Emperor's true intentions, hidden within the missing pages, might have revealed that his vision for humanity's future was far more complex and tragic than any of his followers could have imagined. The mystery of the missing pages of the Lectitio Divinitatus will likely never be solved, and perhaps it is fitting that they remain lost. For the Imperium itself is a place defined by the absence of knowledge, where the past is obscured by the present's desperate need to survive. The missing pages, though they may have held the potential for profound revelations, are now simply a symbol of the Imperium's inability to confront the truth about its origins and its purpose. The people of the Imperium will continue to worship the Emperor as a god, and the Ecclesiarchy will continue to wield power in his name. But the real truth may forever remain hidden in the shadows of history. So, as we stand at the edge of the known universe, gazing into the abyss of uncertainty, we can only ask, will humanity ever uncover the truth? Or will it continue to live in ignorance, worshipping a god it never truly understood, and perhaps never will? Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of the Lectitio Divinitatus, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more explorations into the hidden histories of the Warhammer 40k universe. Let the journey continue.